What is behind the recent spate of violent attacks in Burundi? What prompted the Burundian government's recent deadline to hand in illegal weapons? Were there any lessons learned from the 1994 ethnic-related Rwandan genocide? And is the newly established African Standby Force a solution to conflict and prone countries? What time is it? It's question time. Good evening and welcome to Question Time. My name is Sipi Wonzaombi, once again standing in for Mpotsedu. Now, over 200 people have died and 200,000 have fled the East African country of Burundi. The violence is said to have started after President Pierre Nkurunziza declared in April this year that he would seek a third term in office. He subsequently won the controversial elections in July, but meanwhile, there are growing concerns that the security situation in the country may result in a repeat of the ethnic violence that triggered the 1994 genocide in neighboring Rwanda. Today on Question Time, we ask, could the newly launched African Standby Force be a solution to prone or conflict-prone countries such as Burundi? A reminder that you can also call in right here in studio. The number is 089-110-4210 or 002789-110-4210. Or rather, just go and find us on Twitter. The Twitter handle is @QuestionTime24. Now, my guest in studio today is Aisha Gaji, who is a political analyst with a focus on African governance and developments. We welcome you on the show, Aisha. But first, before we get into our discussion, let's quickly have a look at this video.
The Secretary General is alarmed by the ongoing escalation of violence in Burundi. He expresses grave concern that in recent weeks, the discovery of the bodies of civilian victims, many apparently summarily executed, has become a regular occurrence in several neighborhoods of Bujumbura. Just today, the son of a prominent Burundian human rights defender, Pierre Nkurunziza, was killed following his arrest by the police in Bujumbura. The recurring violence and killings must stop. The Secretary General underlines the responsibility of the Burundian authorities to protect the civilian population, regardless of political affiliation, and to ensure that the widespread impunity for these heinous acts is brought to an immediate end.
Aisha, thank you so much for joining us once again. There's just no denying at this point that Burundi is actually an anarchist state.
Well, certainly the situation there is escalating and escalating rapidly. We've seen that, in the past few months alone, over 200 people, 250 people have been killed. And this recent weekend has seen a spate of attacks, particularly on social areas such as bars and pubs, etc., with 9 being killed execution style on Saturday alone.
Now we see that the United Nations is coming up front and, putting out its word and saying that these killings must stop in Burundi. Can you see more remedial action perhaps being taken besides that?
I think really, the East African community should be very, very concerned. Neighboring countries such as Tanzania, Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda are going to be bearing the brunt of the refugees from this crisis. Already over 200,000 people have left the country. So it's really a matter that ought to be resolved firstly at the regional level, and if that can't be done, then perhaps at the continental level by the AU. Now, of course, the African Union, in my opinion, ought to have stepped in months ago when Mr. Nkurunziza said he was going to go for a third term. It appeared to be doing so, the African Union, and then seemed to backtrack, and seemed to say, well, it's a matter of internal sovereignty. But when, for example, the Constitutional Court judge, the deputy judge president of the Constitutional Court, had to flee Burundi because he didn't agree with this decision to go for a third term. That was the point at which the region and the continent ought to have stepped in, because it could be seen that even from legal opinion, there was dissent. And with the numbers of people coming out on the streets since April, there was a lot of popular opposition to this nomination or this wanting to have a third term on the part of Mr. Nkurunziza.
Him standing in for a third term rose, as you said, that it brought about a lot of conflict. There was division. Over 200,000 people fled the country. Do you think that perhaps this shakes him in any way, especially that is going to stand in for a third term, which was in question before he even took position?
I don't think it really makes much difference to Mr. Nkurunziza. He seems determined that he's going to see out this term. So at this point, trying to remove him is going to be non-productive and not profitable for anybody in Burundi. My suggestion would be that one or more of the continental bodies, perhaps the regional body, the East African Community, as well as the continental body, the African Union, ought to together put some pressure on Mr. Nkurunziza and on his opponents to perhaps broker some kind of power-sharing deal for the remainder of this 5-year term, with an assurance that he will not then seek a further presidential term.
This has also triggered fear about this perhaps leading to the 1994 Rwandan genocide, a similar encounter, or perhaps this could end up being that. That's a general notion. Do you think that perhaps would get there?
I think that's, to some extent, I think that's scaremongering, or I thought that was scaremongering until fairly recently. But recent statements by certain senior members of the government have been quite chilling. Let me put it that way. Things like, for example, the chairperson, the president of the Burundi Senate, coming out and saying, well, at the moment, police are shooting in the legs. But when we tell them to go to work, and that word work, quote unquote work, is a very heavily coded word in Burundi and Rwanda. It was used during the Rwandan genocide as a euphemism to go and kill Tutsis and sympathetic Hutus. So we need to be very careful with language like this, because it is language that is very easily understood within the Burundian population, within anyone who speaks Kinyarwanda, and it is language that really seeds fear and tension. And so from my contacts on the ground in Burundi, what I'm hearing is that there's a climate of fear at the moment in Bujumbura, that the Imbonerakure, who are the youth militia of the ruling party, similar to the Interahamwe of the Rwandan genocide in 1994, have been making, again, chillingly similar statements about getting rid of Inyenzi. Now, Inyenzi means cockroaches. Again, that was a word that was used as code for killing Tutsis. And while the Burundian population is 85% Hutu, the Tutsis are a small minority. It's really, it's a country that won my admiration after 2005 when the civil war ended, for the way in which they approached the ethnic issue. Unlike in Rwanda, where people don't discuss ethnicity. In Burundi, it's openly discussed. There's provision for power sharing within parliament, within most levels of government, etc. They've got a very, very strong, they had a very, very strong drive to building a cohesive, multi-ethnic society. And I'm sad to see that this seems to be breaking down.
But can we see the intervention of other African countries? We know that in 2001, South Africa deployed its mass soldiers under the auspices of the UN, 700 soldiers. Can we see that perhaps being done again, not just in South Africa, but other neighboring countries as well?
I certainly think that, with the operationalization, or the soon-to-be operationalized African Standby Force, that's certainly an option to look at. But peacekeeping is not a long-term solution to the kinds of problems we're seeing in Burundi, if indeed they are taking on an ethnic slant. Initially, they seem to be very much party-based, but unfortunately, as I said, the language of the last few weeks seems to indicate there's a slant towards ethnic violence, towards inciting hatred. There's certainly been a clampdown on journalists, on human rights activists, etc. And not just on the activists themselves, but also on their families, again, seeding very insidious fear. An activist may not fear for his or her own life, but they fear for the lives of their children. Now, when a child of a human rights activist is shot in cold blood, again, mafia style, execution style, that chills the activities of other human rights workers as well.
But why is there such slow progress, or rather slow action, when it comes to African political organizations which could have senior power when it comes to intervention in that country? Why is there such slow, slacking progress in intervention?
I think because for very many years, particularly under the Cold War and its immediate aftermath, we had a situation in newly independent African countries where there was a sense that that one didn't interfere in the sovereignty of a neighboring state, of a brother state, that there was a sense that, the Organization of African Unity was really a big boys club where they supported each other no matter what atrocities were committed in their name. So there's, I think, still some residual lack of political will amongst certain quarters within the African Union and within the regional communities such as the EAC and SADC, etc. And that is something we really have to strive to overcome. We need to be able to criticize one another without fear or favor, without saying, well, so-and-so helped us in our liberation struggle, so-and-so has been very supportive of our country or of Burundi or whatever, and so we can't actually go out and criticize them. It's time that our leaders put the citizens of our continent first, rather than their fellow leaders.
Just talking about criticism as well, we know that President Nkurunziza came under hot scrutiny before he proposed standing on for a third term, but still he continued nonetheless. Now we're seeing results today in his plight to really appeal to the constituencies of Rwanda, or rather Bujumbura. What else can he do to remedy himself?
I think if he shows willingness to talk to his opponents, to share, as I said earlier, to come to some kind of power-sharing deal with them, we might have... A
coalition government?
A coalition government of some sort, a government of so-called national unity. I know they haven't been very successful elsewhere on the continent, but at least a show of good faith towards working together and resolving the tensions rather than allowing the tensions to decline. Unfortunately, Mr. Nkurunziza is now in a position of power. He's in a position of power and he's announced this deadline last weekend where, weapons were going to be collected, any illegal weapons were going to be collected. And what we've been hearing is that neighborhoods of Bujumbura have been targeted that are known to be opposition strongholds. Now, when you're targeting your opponents, that doesn't augur well for wanting to then come to resolve tensions.
All right. Well, let's hold it right there for now. After the break, we'll be joined by Sarah Jackson via Skype, and she'll be giving us, just breaking down the situation in Burundi, as she is very well clued up on what's happening in that country. Stay with us. Remember that the number you can call is 089 110 4210. We'll be back shortly.
This week we are taking you around the continent, telling you stories about what makes Africa, Africa.
We now head to the Kenyan coast, where we meet a man using needles to fight a growing drug culture.
A recent study revealed that there are 850 drug addicts in Diani alone, with over 220 using injectable drugs such as heroin.
In my community, I've seen a lot of these people suffer.
The Journal, every Saturday at 1:30 on SABC News.
Well, welcome back. You're still watching Question Time right on SABC News Channel 404. Like I said before the break, we are now joined by Sarah Jackson, who is a political analyst and rather who's been following the situation in Burundi, but she's joining us in Nairobi. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on Question Time. Now, we see bodies lying all over the streets. The killings are still continuing in Burundi. Is there perhaps some kind of action that you see from the government? Mr. Nkurunziza himself being in power, do you see him perhaps bringing interventions to make sure that there is peace in the country?
Well, the situation in Burundi is getting worse by the day. Killings are continuing unabated. Human rights defenders are being targeted. The son of a human rights defender was killed last Friday. So far from improving, the situation is worsening, and we've seen a resounding lack of government action to hold those responsible to account. Indeed, I've been working on Burundi for the past 9 years, and this is the worst situation I've seen in that time.
But now, when it comes to the intervention of the AU and the UN, do you perhaps see better action being taken, or perhaps a deployment of soldiers in the country, military force?
We saw a very positive statement by the African Union in October, one of the strongest statements that they've ever produced, calling for human rights observers to be deployed in Burundi, calling for the dialogue to be restarted, and calling for targeted sanctions. We're now calling on the African Union to really put these words into action and to provide support to President Museveni as he restarts this dialogue.
When it gets to media reporting, as you said that you've worked in Burundi for a couple of years, the situation has changed. We know that your emergency services also have been held at halt. We know that there have been some political members and some officials, government officials also, who were killed in these killings. Just talking about the situation getting better, what besides political tension and President Nkurunziza stepping in for third term, what else could be the pushing force, or rather motivating force behind this?
Indeed, there have been state officials that have been targeted too, individuals within the police. What we saw were protests in opposition to President Nkurunziza standing again. These protests were then crushed by the security services through excessive force. The protests then became increasingly violent, and we've seen some arming in opposition neighborhoods. What's needed now is really a dialogue, as Aisha has said, to bring the different parties to the table to try and resolve this political crisis in a political way.
This is nothing new in Burundi. We saw this 1994 genocide in Rwanda, the neighboring country. We also know that as far back as from the 1300s, Burundi has been faced with political tensions, with striving for power and all sorts of things. What else do you believe that perhaps a coalition government could remedy the situation in the country?
Well, we actually saw remarkable progress in Burundi since 2005. We saw a power-sharing government, relative space for media and civil society to operate in comparison to some other countries in the region. So what we've seen now is a huge disaster for Burundi, an enormous step backwards. It's not for Amnesty International to dictate what kind of agreement should be reached, but what's really crucial is the different actors get around a table under regional leadership and discuss and come to some kind of agreement that will allow respect for human rights once again.
Now, Aisha, you also made some statements earlier on alluding to the fact that there seems to be fear when it comes to sharing of power in Africa. We know this is not just an issue in Burundi, in Africa in general, but we know that African states, when it also comes to the issue of sovereignty, there is perhaps a need to revise the intervention of these higher political bodies or other organizations. Do you perhaps see that happening in any time?
Well, I certainly hope so. I think we have now a situation where, unlike 20 years ago, where all the leaders would tend to close ranks and support one another, we now have a situation where we do have a few leaders. It's a small number, but it's a growing number, who actually do come out and say, hang on, guys, this is wrong. This isn't how it ought to be. You should be putting the interests of your people first. So hopefully, as time goes on, as our democracies mature more and more, we'll see more and more leaders of this caliber come out. But then to go back, in 2005, for his first term, Mr. Nkurunziza actually did really well. Even his second term, the first half of it was pretty okay. It was pretty stable. It was really towards the latter part of that second term when he began to fear losing power, when he decided he wanted to hang on to the fruits of that power. And of course, there are, commercial, economic gains, if you will, to be had from political power and the connections that come from political power. There's always a nexus of economic and political power. And of course, it was during the second half of that term, and it started off in the rural areas more, where the youth wing, the youth militia of the ruling party was terrorizing rural villages. And it was not making international news. At times, it wasn't even making national news because it was in pockets. But it gave us an idea of where, if left unrestricted that kind of power would lead to. And it's led directly to the situation we're seeing in Bujumbura
But
today.
this is the kind of behavior you would perhaps expect in new democracies. In a state or capital that assumed independence in 1962, definitely there should be a better way, or rather better methods and approach when it comes to issues of peace and elections and democracy, so to say. Why aren't we seeing that?
I think that's true if we'd had uninterrupted democracy in Burundi, but that hasn't been the case. 2004, the deal that brought us to elections, or brought Burundians to elections in 2005, actually ended a very bloody, more than a decade-long civil war there. And so that interruption of democracy, those episodes of civil conflict in Burundi, as in our neighboring Angola or Mozambique even, are interruptions of democracy where war reigns, where conflict is basically the order of the day. And people, unfortunately, have short memories. And you've got to then rebuild democratic institutions and a democratic consciousness, a civilian democratic consciousness, again from scratch. And that is why I say it's so important right now at this moment not to allow Burundi to escalate back into civil conflict, full-fledged civil conflict. Because if that happens...
This has exactly triggered that. It has triggered that fear that this will not only lead to Burundi turning into a genocide state, it will also lead to other Western, Eastern, Southern, Northern countries in Africa.
Yes, that possibility exists. It's, of course, a worst-case scenario. I would call it a doomsday scenario. But at the same time, already the influx of at least half of those 200,000 refugees from Burundi have entered Tanzania. There are already reports coming from across the river in Tanzania that local Tanzanians, who were originally very, very tolerant of the refugees coming in and very welcoming towards them, are now changing that tune because more aid is going to the refugees. Local populations feel they're being neglected in favor of the refugees, etc. And there's the danger then of xenophobic tension arising, not just in Tanzania, but in the other neighbors as well, where refugees have fled to.
Sarah, do you agree with some of the points that have been made by Aisha in studio?
Absolutely. A large number of people have had to flee Burundi. And of course, this can lead to tension in neighboring countries. So this is not just a risky situation for Burundi, but a risky situation for a very volatile region. It's absolutely essential now that the East African community resolve some of their internal differences of opinion between Rwanda and Tanzania, so that Uganda can really take this leadership and this mediation forward.
Now, let's get into the effects, or rather the heart of these killings. Take us through the day-to-day runnings in Burundi. Are perhaps shops closed, schools closed, the daily operation? Definitely some made assertion, or rather indication to the fact that this might affect the economy. Do you perhaps see that happening, or has that been happening?
We've already seen a remarkable decline in the Burundian economy, in the Burundian franc. Business was affected deeply during the protests, and a large amount of aid has already been cut. So this is affecting the lives of Burundians. At the same time, life does continue as normal in many parts of the country. These operations are taking place in very specific neighborhoods that are believed to be opposition strongholds, while the government is going door to door to try and disarm those areas. Our concern with the way that this is being done. The police force is not trusted by the population, and people are being killed every day.
All right. Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on Question Time. That was Sarah Jackson, was joining us now at Nairobi, or rather via Skype, not in our Nairobi studios. Just keeping us up to speed with what's happening in Bujumbura and in other African states, in Burundi as well, and how this influx could lead to conflict resoluting to Western countries, Northern countries, and Northern African countries. Now, just a few words, your closing remarks. What else can we expect, or rather, what's the way forward? What's most anticipated to be the way forward in Burundi currently?
I would urge every single African leader whether they're heads of state or not, anybody who regards themselves as a leader and who has the potential to influence this crisis, to put aside their personal concerns. We saw President Kagame of Rwanda do that this weekend. We know that he has kept silent for a long time because he's also wanting to go for a third term, or there are machinations in Rwanda about a third term. But he put those things aside this weekend, and he spoke very emotionally and from the heart, urging Mr. Nkurunziza not to let the situation escalate. So I'm saying that really, if we can use this platform to urge any leaders anywhere on this continent who has some influence over Mr. Nkurunziza and other leaders in Burundi, to urge them to come together, to start a dialogue, to ensure that this does not become a full-fledged civil conflict. I hesitate to use the word you used, the word genocide, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. It's certainly not something we want to see on this continent again.
All right. Thank you so much, Aisha, for joining us. Well, that has been Question Time. My name is Sipiwo Nzaumbi. You'll see Question Time again tomorrow. It's a big thank you to you and the rest of the team. Till tomorrow, it's goodbye.